Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive. And today we're heading to the Himalayas,
Oh, wow.
specifically the Uttarakhand region of India,
Okay.
to explore a poetry collection called Pastures of Wild Asters.
And it's interesting because we're not just looking at, pretty mountain pictures here.
Right.
Our sources paint a picture of this book as something much deeper. We've got Amazon reviews, author bios, even a social media post.
Okay, I have to admit, when I first saw poetry book on our list,
Yeah.
I was picturing like flowery language and rhyming couplets.
Right.
But you're saying Pastures of Wild Asters is a little bit more than that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. From what I've gathered, it's a collection of over 70 poems, and they go way beyond just descriptions of these flowers. We're talking about plant resilience, the poet's personal connection to this region, and even some reflections on the anxieties of city life
Ooh, that's interesting.
for someone so connected to nature.
Yeah, that push and pull between like the peace of nature and then the hustle of city life.
Yeah,
That's something I think a lot of us can relate to.
for sure.
So tell me about Gunjan Joshi, our guide to this world.
Well, Gunjan Joshi wears many hats. She is an editor, a literary critic, and a former journalist.
Wow.
And while she's based in Delhi, Uttarakhand seems to hold a very special place in her heart.
Okay.
Her bio mentions deodar trees, classic literature, and Susan Sontag essays as personal bliss triggers.
Yodo trees and Susan Sontag.
Yay.
That's quite the combination.
Yeah.
I am intrigued already.
Yeah.
It sounds like we're dealing with someone who's really in tune with both the natural world and the world of words.
Exactly. And, that really shines through in these sources that we have. One reviewer who actually grew up in Uttarakhand described reading Joshi's poems as like a homecoming.
Oh, wow.
They mentioned how the words tapped into this shared memory, a deep connection to the land.
It's amazing how art can do that.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
evoke this sense of belonging, even if you've never even been to the place that's being described. It makes me wonder if Joshi's poems achieve this through specific details about Uttarakhand, or if it's more about capturing a universal feeling of connection to nature.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's something we should definitely keep in mind as we kind of go through this.
Okay, so we have this poet who's clearly passionate about Uttarakhand.
Yeah.
And has a knack for evoking a sense of place.
Yes.
What are some of the specific themes or ideas that emerge from Pastures of Wild Asters?
Well, one of the most striking things is how Joshi uses the natural world to explore complex human emotions.
Okay.
For instance, several reviewers mentioned a recurring sense of melancholy or even angst that runs through some of these poems.
Really?
Yeah.
Melancholy isn't the first thing that comes to mind when I think about wildflowers.
Right.
What contributes to this feeling of angst?
Well, there are a few things at play. There's one poem about a poet with a broken soul, and another about the strains of city life for an avid naturalist.
Uh-huh.
It's clear that Joshi isn't shying away from, those darker, more complex emotions that can come with being connected to a place that's facing challenges.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like the beauty and serenity of nature butting up against the anxieties and pressures of modern life.
Exactly.
It's something I think a lot of people can relate to, especially those of us who, find peace in nature, but also have to deal with the realities of living in a city.
Totally. And it seems like Joshi uses specific elements of Uttarakhand's landscape to explore this.
Oh, okay.
One source mentions a poem about a hill river where she uses the river as a metaphor for resilience, adapting to change, yet also bearing the scars of human impact.
That's a powerful image.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder if Joshi is using these nature metaphors to comment on like larger environmental concerns.
Yeah.
Is there a sense of urgency or a call to action in these poems?
Absolutely. Several sources highlight how Joshi's poetry isn't just about admiring beauty,
Right.
but understanding its fragility. There's a sense that she's giving a voice to these plants, these silent witnesses to the changing world, and urging us to pay attention to their stories.
It sounds like she's achieved this really delicate balance, celebrating the beauty of nature while also raising awareness about its vulnerability.
Yeah.
It makes me think of those photos you see of endangered species,
Right.
where there's this sense of awe and wonder, but also this like heartbreaking realization that what you're looking at might not be around for much longer.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. There's this one line that says, "In the heart of every valley, there is a story untold in every flower, a secret whispered only to the wind." Beautiful imagery, but it also carries this undercurrent of urgency, like a reminder that there are so many untold stories, so many secrets we might lose if we're not careful.
Yeah, and so we've got this beautiful poetry about nature, the sense of belonging and connection to this specific place,
Hmm.
and this really subtle but powerful message about environmental responsibility.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm curious to explore some specific poems and passages that really highlight these themes.
I agree. Let's dive into some of those lines and imagery that stood out in the reviews and see what deeper meanings we can uncover.
Okay, let's do it.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned a poem about a hill river. What were some of the details that stood out to you in that one?
Yeah, well, the reviewer actually quoted a few lines that I thought were really striking.
Okay.
Joshi writes, "The hill river, she remembers the weight of glaciers, the whispers of ancient pines. She carries the scars of fallen trees, the echoes of landslides."
Wow, there's so much depth packed into those few words. It's like the river becomes this living record of time,
Right.
witnessing both the beauty and fragility of the natural world.
Yeah.
Makes you think about how even the most enduring elements of nature are shaped by forces beyond their control.
Yes, and there's also this sense of stoicism in the way she describes the river. Like, it doesn't resist these changes. It
Right.
remembers them. It carries them. It kind of speaks to that idea that nature isn't static, you know?
Right.
It's constantly evolving and adapting.
It makes me think about how we as humans often struggle so much with change,
Yeah,
especially when it comes to the environment.
totally.
Maybe there's a lesson to be learned from the river,
Hmm.
a lesson in resilience and acceptance.
That's a really good point. And speaking of human experiences, let's circle back to that feeling of angst we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
I think Joshi uses specific imagery from Uttarakhand to contrast the serenity of nature with, like, the turmoil of city life.
Okay.
For example, there's a line where she writes, "My heart yearns for the stillness of the deodar forest, while the city streets clamor with 1,000 unanswered questions."
Oh, I felt that,
Yeah.
being out in nature always brings me this sense of peace and clarity.
Yeah,
It's like the noise in the city fades away and you can actually connect with something larger than yourself.
right.
But then you go back to the city and it's like that peace becomes a distant memory, something you have to fight to hold on to.
Yes, and Joshi captures that struggle so beautifully in her poetry.
Yeah.
You know, it's not that she's romanticizing nature or demonizing the city.
Yeah.
It's more about acknowledging the complexities of our relationship with both. She recognizes the beauty and the solace that nature offers, but she also doesn't shy away from the challenges of reconciling that with the demands of modern life.
This is where I think her background as a journalist really comes in handy.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
She's able to present these complex issues and emotions
Yeah.
in a way that's both poetic and insightful.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about offering easy answers or preaching a particular viewpoint.
Right.
It's more about like prompting us to reflect on our own experiences
Yeah.
and to consider these questions from multiple angles.
Totally. It's like she's inviting us into a conversation,
Yeah.
a shared exploration of these themes rather than just dictating her perspective.
Right. And speaking of shared exploration, one of the reviews mentioned that Joshi uses a lot of sensory language in her poetry.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have any examples of how she does that?
Yes, absolutely. One reviewer actually described the book as a feast for the senses.
Ooh, I like that.
And there's a line where she writes, "The wind carries the scent of rhododendrons, sweet and intoxicating like a forgotten memory."
That's beautiful. I can almost smell those rhododendrons.
Right.
I think it's so effective when poets use those sensory details.
Agree.
Because it allows the reader to really connect with the poem on a more visceral level. It's not just about understanding the words, but it's about feeling them, experiencing them in your own mind.
Exactly. And Joshi doesn't limit herself to just visual descriptions.
Right.
She also incorporates sounds, smells, even textures into her poems.
Oh, wow.
There's a line where she describes the rough bark of an ancient oak whispering tales of forgotten seasons.
Ooh.
It's like she's bringing the whole forest to life
Yeah.
through these vivid sensory details.
I'm really struck by how Joshi is able to weave together these personal reflections on nature
Yeah.
with this deeper message about environmental responsibility.
Mm.
Are there any other poems that stand out to you in terms of highlighting this connection?
Well, there's one poem titled Ode to a Wild Aster that seems to really encapsulate this idea. One reviewer described it as a love letter to a flower and to the fragile ecosystem it represents.
Oh, wow.
Joshi writes about the aster's resilience, its ability to thrive in these harsh conditions.
Yeah.
But she also acknowledges the threats that it faces from climate change and human encroachment.
I'm curious to hear more about how she tackles those specific environmental threats in her poetry.
Yeah.
Does she become more explicit in her message, or does she maintain that more subtle, evocative style?
That's a great question, and it's definitely something we can explore as we dive into those specific poems.
Okay.
But first, I wanted to mention something else that I found really intriguing in these reviews.
Okay. What's that?
Several people mention this kind of spiritual dimension that seems to permeate Joshi's poetry.
Oh, that's interesting. I'd love to hear more about that. How does she approach this idea of spirituality, and how does it connect to her writing about nature?
Well, it's not about organized religion or dogma or anything like that. It's more about a sense of awe and wonder, a recognition of the interconnectedness of all things. There's a line where she writes, "The mountains breathe a silent wisdom, the trees whisper ancient prayers."
I feel like that sense of spirituality is something that a lot of people experience when they're immersed in nature.
Yeah.
It's like you're tapping into something larger than yourself,
Yeah,
something both ancient and timeless.
for sure.
I'm curious to see how Joshi explores this feeling in more detail through her poetry.
I think you're onto something really profound there. It's like Joshi's reminding us that nature isn't just something we observe or admire.
Right.
It's something we're deeply connected to on a spiritual level. And perhaps through that connection, we can find a deeper understanding of ourselves and our place in the world.
Okay, you've definitely piqued my curiosity.
Ah.
Let's dive into some of these poems and see how Joshi brings these themes to life through her words.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Okay, so we've talked about resilience and that tension between nature and city life, and even that spiritual dimension that Joshi weaves into her work. I'm ready to get into some specific poems and see how she brings these themes to life through her words.
Well, one poem that really stood out to me was Ode to a Wild Aster. Remember how we were talking about Joshi's approach to environmental concern?
Yeah.
This poem seems to be a perfect example of her subtle yet powerful message.
Okay, remind me what stood out to you about this one.
One reviewer described it as like a love letter to a flower and to the fragile ecosystem it represents,
Okay.
which I thought was really spot on. It starts with this beautiful imagery describing the aster's delicate petals and vibrant colors, almost like Joshi is painting a portrait with words.
Yeah, that visual descriptive style really seems to be one of her strengths.
Right?
It makes you feel like you're right there in the Uttarakhand landscape with her.
Exactly. But then there's this shift in tone. Joshi introduces the idea of human encroachment, describing how roads and buildings are slowly closing in on the aster's habitat. She writes, "The wild aster, once a queen of untamed meadows, now finds herself a refugee on the margins of progress."
Oh, that's heartbreaking, but so powerful. That image of the wild aster as a refugee
Yeah.
really drives home the impact we're having on the natural world. It's this gentle but firm reminder that our actions have consequences.
And what I find so compelling is that she doesn't resort to anger or blame.
Right.
Instead, she uses this almost mournful tone, like she's grieving the loss of something precious.
Yeah.
It evokes a sense of empathy. It urges us to consider the perspective of these plants, these voiceless victims of our progress.
It's like she's saying, look what we're doing, look what we're losing,
Yeah,
but without explicitly pointing fingers,
right.
which I think is a much more effective approach.
I agree.
It invites reflection rather than defensiveness.
Exactly. And that's where I think that spiritual dimension comes in.
Yeah.
Remember that line we discussed earlier?
Yeah.
About the mountains breathing wisdom and the trees whispering prayer? Yeah. That same feeling seems to permeate this poem as well.
Okay. I'm curious how that manifests in Ode to a Wild Aster. What are some of the specific words or phrases that evoke that spiritual connection?
Well, towards the end of the poem, Joshi writes, "The wild aster, a tiny beacon of resilience, reminds us that even in the face of adversity, there is beauty, there is hope. Her roots hold the memory of ancient seasons. Her petals carry the promise of renewal."
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
There's definitely a sense of reverence there.
Yeah.
Almost like she's elevating this simple wildflower to a symbol of something much greater.
Yes, and it's not just about the aster itself, It's about recognizing that interconnectedness of all living things, the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth. It's what finding hope and inspiration, even in the face of challenges.
It's making me think about how sometimes we get so caught up in our own human-centric world
Yeah.
that we forget to appreciate the beauty and the wisdom that exists all around us in nature.
Right.
Joshi's poetry seems to be this gentle nudge to pay attention, to listen to those whispers of the wind, to see the world through a different lens.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And, one of the things I find so remarkable about Pastures of Wild Asters is how Joshi manages to weave together these seemingly disparate threads,
Yeah.
Personal reflections, environmental concerns, spiritual insights into this cohesive and compelling tapestry.
It's like each poem is a window into a different facet of her experience. And
Exactly.
together they create this rich, multi-layered portrait of both the natural world and the human heart.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so rewarding.
Yeah.
We're not just analyzing poems.
Right.
We're exploring a way of seeing the world, a way of connecting with something larger than ourselves.
And for me, that's what makes great art so powerful.
Totally.
It transcends the boundaries of language and culture
Yeah.
and speaks to something universal within us.
Uh-huh.
It invites us to question, to reflect, to see the world with fresh eyes.
Beautifully put. And if this deep dive has sparked that sense of wonder or a desire to explore these themes further,
Yeah.
I encourage you to seek out Pastures of Wild Asters and experience the magic of Joshi's words for yourself.
I completely agree. This has been such a fascinating journey into the world of poetry and nature.
It has.
And I'm walking away feeling inspired and ready to pay closer attention to the untold stories that exist all around me.
As you should. Remember, even the smallest wildflower can hold a universe of meaning if we take the time to truly see it.
And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into Pastures of Wild Asters. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking those hidden gems of beauty and wisdom in the world around you.